Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Housing, affordability have been big issues in the news of late, and I read a really fascinating article about the problem is development charges, written by Josef Filipowicz. Josef Filipowicz is a public policy specialist producing research on housing, land use, and local government finance. He previously worked at CMHC, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and the Fraser Institute, and continues to publish independent research reports, op-eds, and blogs on these subjects across Canada and abroad. Josef, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian. It's really nice to be here. Appreciate it.
So tell me, why do you think development charges are the problem to affordable housing?
Well, let's just take a step back here and remind listeners who probably don't need reminding that this province is in a state of crisis when it comes to housing. So prices have doubled in about 10 years. Rental vacancies are precipitously low. So there are clear issues that renters and home buyers are facing, and I think it's no news to your listeners that there's a problem here. And development charges are one of several factors that are contributing to this. So this fiscal tool that local governments can use, unfortunately, as helpful as it can be in some regards, makes already expensive housing even less affordable. So that's the unfortunate reality of this tool.
And you think they're too high?
Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? I personally think yes, they're too high. When you benchmark the fees, and I'm assuming you're talking about the city of Toronto. That was the subject of the article that myself and my colleague Steve wrote about. And if you benchmark Toronto to its both its local peers and its national peers, it charges far higher rates than many of them. And on top of that, not just that, but by next year they're going to rise by almost 50%, by about 47%, I think it is, by May of next year. So development charges are already quite high. They're approximately $93,000 a unit for, I think, single detached houses, and something like about 50, and then there's something like 35,000 per unit for, say, a studio apartment, and then there's a range in between for different types of units.
Let's take a step back and explain to everyone, if you could, what are development charges?
Yeah, absolutely. So they're fees that are levied by municipalities on developers to help pay for the costs of infrastructure. So in that regard, it makes sense. There's this logic, this underlying logic of growth should pay for growth. So essentially, a developer, when they get a development permit, they have to pay based on the number of units or the square footage. They have to pay the municipality a certain amount of money, which then goes to pay for a whole host of hard infrastructure like sewers and water, for example, but also police stations, libraries, etc. So in that regard, it kind of makes sense. You got new residents coming in, and those new residents are paying for these services. Or the hard costs of these services, which are then, once they're maintained, paid for by the general property tax base. So in that regard, there's a certain logic to these fees. But then it starts getting a bit questionable when you see these increases of 47%, for example. It's also questionable when you see the huge range of services that they might cover. Right? You've got all the hard infrastructure that I mentioned before. But when cities start funding, for example, childcare spaces or social housing, then you start to think, well, is that really what these fees are meant to cover? Is that, philosophically, if you're thinking about the idea of growth paying for growth, is that really the best tool, and is that really the best group of folks who should be paying for it? And when I say group of folks, I mean first-time buyers. I mean newcomers, essentially. So that's the kind of question, at least on a philosophical basis, that I think cities should be asking themselves when thinking through whether they want to use this tool, which is a politically appealing tool. I'll be honest. The current tax base doesn't have to pay for it, but you really gotta ask yourself, is this the most appropriate way to be funding these services, which are important, but is this really the way to do it?
Okay, so let me ask you a couple of questions and see what you think.
Yeah.
So I think the vast majority of people think that development charges are paid for by developers. Are development charges paid for by developers or by the end consumer?
Well, it's the end consumer. I think I'm sure you've had developers on this show before who will tell you the exact same thing, and it's for a very simple reason. These costs just are basically baked into pro forma calculations. So when a developer, before engaging a project, when they're thinking about the feasibility of it, they think of all their costs. They think of the hard costs. They think of the labor costs. They think of the land costs, and then they bake in these costs as well, these development charges. And if they can make the math work, then it works. But it only works if they can sell it at a certain price, right? So they're not going to do it unless they can pass the cost on. Otherwise, there's no point in they're not going to do it out of the goodness of their hearts, not because they're
I think
bad people.
I think this is the one first conceptual thing that you got to get appreciation for within the general population, because I think the general populace believes that development charges are paid for by the developers. At least that's what politicians might like to lead us to believe, when they actually are paid, as you said, by the end consumer. The developers just pass it on. Okay, so the next question. Do the development charges pay for the actual incremental costs of providing servicing to that new development, or are the charges far in excess of the actual incremental cost of providing services to that new unit?
So that's a fascinating study that I think should be done. I have not done it, but it's one that's totally worth doing. That's why we start using these benchmarks. For example, if Toronto is charging rates that are twice what's being charged in Burlington, for example, then you start thinking, well, why is that? Why is it that libraries, water, sewer, police stations, why is it that it costs twice as much to offer in Toronto than in Burlington? You start asking questions like that, and that's where I think citizens should really bring the microscope onto their own
Well, and I think
locale.
the vast majority of studies have shown that actually infrastructure in an urban environment for additional units is far cheaper than providing infrastructure, roads, sewers, water, etc., to single-family homes in far-flung suburbia.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the per unit cost, if you've got a huge apartment building, the per unit cost is going to be far lower than the per unit cost for single family homes, which is why it's interesting that you'll see in some of these benchmarking studies that single family homes actually have lower development charges than some other types of units. It's a weird sort of quirk, but you'll see it sometimes when you see the breakdown between the different housing types. So it kind of breaks the logic, in my opinion, of these fees, and it's another kind of smoking gun, if you want to call it that, that demonstrates that these fees are often out of touch, or at least out of sync with what you would think that they would normally philosophically or otherwise fund.
Not just philosophically, economically. We're talking to Josef Filipowicz, is that correct?
Filipowicz. It's
Filipowicz.
Yeah.
Filipowicz.
Yeah.
I apologize. About development charges in the Greater Toronto Area. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Josef in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.
Great.
Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're talking about housing affordability and the role that development charges play in the lack of housing affordability. Josef Filipowicz is a public policy specialist producing research on housing, land use, and local government finance. He's worked at CMHC, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and the Fraser Institute, and he continues now to publish independent research reports, op-eds, and blogs on these subjects in Canada and abroad. We've been talking about development charges, and I think, first of all, what we established is that probably development charges are passed on to the consumer, not paid for by the developers. Number two, that they're probably in excess of the actual cost of the infrastructure that's actually being provided. So there's a profit element that cities are building into them, and that in your Toronto versus Burlington example, Philip, apologize, Joseph, they are too high in Toronto relative to the logical costs, and too low in Burlington, probably relative to the logical costs of providing that infrastructure. So why is this all messed up? And actually, before I ask you that question, in so many other parts of society, we think user fees are bad. You know, we don't pay the full cost of subways and buses. We don't pay the full cost of going to a library. We don't pay the full cost of using an arena. For some reason, we've got this attitude that society provides, you know, things for a benefit to all of society, and yet there are some user fees for library cards or for use of hockey arenas and swimming pools, but we don't charge people the full cost of those because we think it's a societal benefit, and even people that can't afford it should have the right to go, I guess. But here we're overcharging the user fee. What's the justification for that?
Well, the thing with development fees is that they seem like a perfect revenue source from a local policymaker's perspective. You got to think about it. You have your local tax base, basically your voter base, because it's current residents, not future residents. What do they want? Well, they want as many services, as many amenities, as many libraries, et cetera, as possible. They want, you know, it's just normal to want as much as you can get and pay as little as you can for it. So that's, you know, electorally, it's an appealing tool to be able to go to your electorate, promise this, promise that, fund it using a source that is not paid by current taxpayers. It's paid by people who don't yet live in the community or who are just moving to it. So it seems, again, it seems ideal. It seems like the goose that'll lay a golden egg. The problem with that is that, you know, somebody has to pay for it, right? And local governments aren't electorally sensitive to that group of people, and that group of people is first-time buyers. It's renters and newcomers who are finding it increasingly difficult to find apartments, to find the first home. So it's not exactly the group of people you want to rely on as a revenue source. You don't really want to penalize these people for looking for their first home or for looking for a place to rent. But that's ultimately what these fees do when they're undue. So it's kind of an insidious problem that is not, again, it's local elections are not really sensitive to them. So we're more likely to see this kind of tool used or abused when it's such an attractive tool politically.
So I understand that for a local ward, a local councillor might not be influenced by it because people aren't moving, you know, are the people that are being charged this development fee aren't currently my electors in that local ward. But when you're talking about a province, in comparison, they're probably moving between someplace in that province and another place in that province. And so therefore, from a provincial standpoint, it's got to be very relevant. And even when you think about the city of Toronto, the vast majority of people that are going to be buying a condo in the city of Toronto are probably already in the city of Toronto. And if not the city of Toronto, at least in the greater Toronto area. We can't just blame, you know, all new housing demand on immigrants and people moving in from other provinces. They live here. They're our own kids. They're our own,
absolutely,
their own population. Like, I don't understand. Yep. I don't understand why these politicians are so unaware of the impact they're having on their future electorates.
Well, in policy, we use especially in tax policy, there's a term called visibility. And it's not like a home buyer gets a receipt for the home that they purchased and it says 25% of the cost is fees, right, that you paid as development charges. So unless you have that kind of visibility, unless people are seeing that there's a tangible impact here, they're not going to make that connection. And I don't blame them, right? They're not seeing it. But again, it's an insidious problem because
is that maybe one of the problems is that smart people like you have got to start educating us as to what that is. You know, I used to go to my local gas station and Doug Ford slapped a sticker on every single gas pump telling me how much of what I'm paying went in taxes. And people started to pay attention when that sticker's right there. And, you know, I had a mortgage broker on my show who said that, and, you know, I have no idea what his source for the number was, but I think you were saying 90,000. He was saying that the development charges are $140,000 a unit in the Greater Toronto area. So maybe we need to have smart people like you actually tell us and put if not stickers on the homes, but you know, make sure that we're all aware of how much these development charges are.
Yeah, it's often it ranges in the 20 to 25% range. That's what I've seen in all of the studies that I've read on the subject, which is that's huge, right? That's enormous. And the $140,000 dollar number you cited, I think you're more likely to see that in York region. I think that's where those cities are where it's typically the highest, like Vaughan and Markham, for example. And Toronto's going to join those two cities by next year as one of the three highest in the entire GTA with the jumps that I was talking about. So when you see that, and then when you see elsewhere in the GTA, you'll have fees that are under the $50,000 range. I'm not saying that one is, that 50,000 is the right number. I'm just saying there's this huge difference between the two, and there needs to be an explanation there because they're all funding libraries, they're all funding roads and sewers. So where does that discrepancy come from? Is it really necessary? I mean, if you itemize everything, is it really necessary for this, for that item to be paid for through this tool, or are there better tools, more equitable tools that don't, create more housing scarcity, which is the last thing we need in this province?
What would be the other tool?
Well, it all depends on, first of all, political feasibility. We just talked about how unappealing it is to hike property taxes for any reason, right? But that used to be one of the sources that would fund these instruments. Development charges didn't exist until I think 1989, and yet prior to that, we still had libraries, we still had sewers, et cetera. So there were different funding mechanisms, including more money from the province, which again, that's coming out of the income tax. But the idea was these are important projects, like the York Durham sewer. It was this massive mega project that took decades to produce, and it enabled cities like Markham to exist. It was a multi-decade project that cost billions of dollars that the province conceptualized and rolled out over years and years and years, and that was part of the that was covered by the general tax base. So that's no longer how things are done. I know Ontario had to get its fiscal house in order in the 90s, and now municipalities are faced with some of these costs. So there's that angle. But then there's also, as I said, the politically appealing nature of these tools, right? If you were to have other, they're called value capture tools, that would somehow capture the value that's being created, the land lift, the increase in land values that are produced by certain amenities or certain pieces of infrastructure. They might be less attractive, right? There's tools that exist like tax increment financing, which basically has a miniature levy on an area that's around, say, a subway station to cover the cost of that subway station. So it's the land lift caused by the station that's helping pay for it. That's not really politically appealing to people who live near the station. I don't think so. So that's part of why we're in the situation we're in with the tools that are being used.
Okay, but tax increment financing, if it was on new development around a subway station or something that actually really did bring the land values up, isn't that sort of like a development charge, but just paid over time? Because it's property tax, but paid over time, right?
Yep, and it's that would be more visible to residents. I remember what I was talking about, visibility. When the developer pays it, it's not visible, so they're paying for it. It's just not immediately visible to them. Maybe there's more second thought. When you see the cost broken down in your property tax bill, you think, did I really want that subway station? Did I really want that stadium? It's often used for stadiums. Out west, you'll see it pretty frequently as a tool for redevelopment around stadiums.
Tax increment financing.
Yeah. So, and in the U.S., it's used as well. So it's definitely a more visible tool. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's a way of getting at the same thing in a I would say a more transparent way, and also it's clearer, right? This is the bill for this item, and I'm going to pay for it, versus having this. Well, actually, it's not itemized, but having essentially a more expensive house and not knowing why. And it's again, it's really insidious how fees can impact affordability. Either the costs are passed on directly because the developer can, right? They can sell the units at a high enough price to justify it, Or and this is the most insidious way in which it'll impact scarcity and affordability is that builders will look at they'll draft a pro forma, they'll look at some lots, they'll realize they can't pay that much for land because all of these costs that are being added on top of all of their hard costs already, and they just won't buy the property. They won't even engage. So all of these developments that would have otherwise happened, right? It's almost impossible to calculate, right? We call it the unseen, right? What's not being developed because it's not financially feasible to develop it. That's another way in which it impacts affordability, especially for renters or for newcomers.
So, if you accept the premise that the development charges are greater than they need to be to pay for the actual cost of the infrastructure, and you accept that it's a user fee, and so therefore it may not be philosophically equal to our attitude toward user fees in a bunch of other areas of society, and that some of the development charges are going to things that are of general nature, like libraries, police stations, parkland, public art, things like that. And so therefore the development charge should be less. Shouldn't it be property taxes that need to be higher? And so therefore the question's got to be, are property taxes too low in Toronto?
Oh, that's another landmine question. I think every analysis every analysis that I've seen of what's called tax supported services points to even the operating costs of much of what's used. So never mind the capital costs that we're talking about, the ongoing costs. You're not recovering that from the residential property tax. You're recovering that from the commercial property tax, which is often multiples of the residential, right? So the barber shop next to the barber shop, which is in a converted house, is a commercial use, and the house is a residential use. Well, the barbershop will probably be paying 2-3 times the amount that the house is in property taxes, despite using roughly the same amount of local servicing. So
okay, and so I'm going to ask you a question.
That's a different story.
So think about Toronto relative to its suburban nature and neighbors, if you could.
Yeah.
And you're the expert here, but from what I understand, is the property tax based on a mill rate, based on the market value of the home, in Toronto is the lowest of the whole GTA area, and so therefore the property taxes, residential property taxes based on the percentage of market value assessed, is low in Toronto and higher in the suburban areas. Commercial might be the opposite, where the commercial is high in Toronto and potentially lower in Vaughan and Mississauga and places like that. And I just got to ask you, does that make economic sense? You've got this, we all know about the benefits of agglomeration, about people getting together, the dynamics of the big city. Toronto is the economic engine of Ontario, if not all of Canada, other than maybe the oil and gas business out west. Wouldn't it make more sense to allow companies to thrive and create jobs and economic opportunity in Toronto, and not force them, from an economic standpoint, not force them, but giving them a economic incentive to move to the burbs? And if Toronto's property taxes are lower than everywhere else, what's the justification? Residential, what's the justification for that? Shouldn't they be the same, if nothing else, on a percentage of market value, or frankly a little bit higher?
Look, I agree with you. I think it boils down to politics again, right? Businesses don't vote. And when you're Toronto, you have the luxury of being able to, the marginal business can be shooed away because you have so much business in the central business district. You've got so many large commercial taxpayers that you're just batting away interest, whereas the small community further away might not have that luxury. So that's their motivation. Their financial motivation to attract business. That would be a motivation to lower property taxes on commercial uses. But the large cities that have the central business districts, they have no reason they can just keep the party going. That's what Calgary did until the oil crash, and now they're really reckoning fiscally. The city is reckoning with the choices that they made. I think they had a ratio of 4-to-1 commercial property taxes to residential property taxes, and they're reining that in very slowly and very painfully. And who's ultimately going to have to be paying more? It's residents. It's a mix of residents paying more, thinking twice about some of the services that you're providing, or some of the facilities that you want to fund. Maybe you pare down that capital budget. Maybe you pare down all of those priorities, and really think twice about that additional arena. Do we really need that additional arena, or does that library really need this IT, whatever? Those are the tough questions that Calgary is asking itself, and that Toronto isn't, because its central business district has not collapsed the way that it did in Calgary after the oil crash in 2014-15.
So you've used the word insidious several times in our conversation today. And you've said that development charges make housing more expensive than it otherwise would be, or alternatively, what it does is it makes housing less adequately supplied than it otherwise would be, because developers can't make an adequate, reasonable profit. So therefore, the development charges causes them to not build, which makes sense. That you're increasing the cost of construction, the cost to develop, and so therefore you're going to make less given any set market price than you otherwise would. So clearly, it's got to have impacted price and also have impacted supply. Why is that a problem?
Sorry, why is what a problem?
What I just described, what you described, and what I tried to summarize. Why is that a problem? Why is that a negative?
Well, so again, it looks like it's this perfect revenue source from a local councillor's point of view, but ultimately, who does this hurt? Right, this hurts the most vulnerable among us. The scarcity that I mentioned is created by those buildings that just aren't feasible to build. Is part of the reason why we have high rents. It's part of the reason why we have low vacancy rates, right? So who does that hurt? Typically, renters have lower incomes than homeowners, almost always. So is it really appropriate to further a bad situation and to hurt the most vulnerable among us? That's why I use the terms like insidious, because it's not really the way that it's seen when the decision is being taken at City Hall, but that's ultimately who it's going to hurt, right?
So
it's going to make the city.
It's hurting renters, it's hurting immigrants, it's hurting first-time home buyers, it's hurting young people.
Yep. And immigrants could be anybody coming from anywhere in the country, as you said, right? A city like Toronto is dynamic; it's got agglomeration. So how many people are going to rethink that job opportunity in Toronto, and as a result, maybe not further their career as much as they otherwise would have? The term for that is a spatial misallocation. That's an urban economics term. But how many people would otherwise move to the city if they could afford it? And what would that do to GDP? What would that do to the broader economy and opportunity, et cetera? So there's all these spillover effects.
Well, I read this book by Richard Florida called "Who's My City" that said the two most important decisions you make in life are who you're going to marry and where you're going to live. And that if you wanted to, and he went through this whole, the world is spiky analysis that said that you had to live in the great cities. And then of late, I've been hearing all these reports that no, young people should move to Calgary or somewhere else and not live in Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver, because they're going to be economically harmed by deciding to live in Toronto or Vancouver for the rest of their lives because of the cost of housing. So it really negatively impacts the people that it shouldn't. It's not fair.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, the rationale for development fees it's not entirely wrong, right? The idea that growth should pay for growth, right? This mantra is not in and of itself wrong. But when you start looking at the list of,
it only makes sense if it's only for the actual cost. And then I come back to, even if it's for the actual cost, why is this the one area where we say user fees at full cost are appropriate when we don't do it in almost anything else in society? We don't charge 100% user fees anywhere else because we think it's a societal benefit.
I agree. And I think it's but part of it, I mean, if you don't have to go too far to see places that still think that way, right? In Quebec, as I understand it, the province shoulders a huge chunk of the infrastructure burden. It's just understood that growth is something that the province is in charge of, and municipalities work on the minutia. And this shows up in any analysis of comparative analysis of developer fees. Montreal's got far lower fees than Toronto. The suburbs of Montreal have far lower fees than Montreal. And I'm talking like less than a quarter of what Toronto's are. This is from memory, but they're incredibly low. So this is a choice, right? It's a political choice and it's an understanding that the province's role is to do that. So maybe it's in more economically Quebec's not an economically depressed market, but markets where you're not seeing just these enormous increases in land values. It might be less tempting for local governments to try to capture some of that.
Josef Filipowicz is our guest tonight. We're talking about development charges. He's also, I think, got some opinions on a bunch of the other things impacting housing affordability. So we're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes and talk about some of those other things that Premier Ford and his housing minister and other issues that are going on that impact housing affordability. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're talking tonight about housing affordability, specifically development charges, with Josef Filipowicz, who is an expert on this topic, has recently written a really interesting article on development charges, and we've been focused on that. But Josef, I wonder if we can widen the conversation a little bit. Obviously, I am of the opinion that development charges are too high, are overcharged, are hidden. As you point out, they're not transparent to the people, so that people don't realize they're there. And I think, worst of all, I think that for some reason politicians have been able to persuade the electorate that it's bad, big, rich developers that are paying it, rather than their kids or them when we move into a condo or move into a new house or something like that, and they don't realize that it's actually us that are paying it, and as you say, a lot of the most vulnerable renters and newcomers and the like. Anyway, CMHC did a big study on housing affordability, and they said that 15% or so of the issue was caused by low interest rates. 10% or so was caused by foreign buyers. They said the vast majority of it was lack of supply, based not on just development charges, as we've talked about, but on red tape, that it took too long to get approvals from local municipal governments, that they demanded too many things, and the lack of certainty was such. So it's not just the cost that we've talked about, development charges, but it's the time, it's the lack of certainty, the political process involved, etc. What do you think about that? Does that argument hold water?
Absolutely. To me, it's the number one issue facing our communities and affordability in general is how long does it take, how much does it cost, and how certain is the process. Those three items, and this is a subject I've studied for a long time. Those three items are recurring bugbears of the development industry and of affordability. Ultimately, the first thing I did as an intern at the Fraser Institute was work on a survey to try to measure these things, and I'm glad CMHC is doing that. And I think they and provinces should do more to shed light on how much it costs, how many layers there are to the process, and how long they take, and how much uncertainty there is on for each of those steps. I know it's a lot of work, but it's really important work, because unless the light is shed on that, people don't know it's an issue, and also you can't compare the performance of municipalities to one another.
So the Ford government has taken a bunch of actions to try to change this of late. Bill 23 and some other things that have come out. Let's talk about some of the things that they've talked about. Number one is that as of right, building opportunities are going to increase, such that you can do things. You can increase your density without having to go through any kind of approval process in certain specific areas. That it's going to be harder for people to complain about your development and object and take you to the Ontario Land Tribunal. That mayors in some cities with minorities can override planning decisions made by full councils that the Globe and Mail has criticized as being undemocratic. What do you think about some of these things that the Ford government's come out with?
I mean, we could take those one by one.
Please do.
There's a lot to unpack there. I mean, it's been quite the season, because it's all of this has happened within a season, right? This is not even yeah. I can't think of any time in my lifetime when there's been as much action on the housing front. So I'm pretty happy about what's going on. I don't know ultimately how this is all going to end up, but I'm pretty optimistic about where this is going, and the fact that it might continue until we see some meaningful results. So the first thing you mentioned was the zoning change. So great. Let folks do more with their properties. That's fantastic. If folks want to have two additional units, basement unit or a garden suite, perfect. Now, the devil's going to be in the details. From what I've seen so far in the act, I don't see the province in any way getting involved in floor area, which is really what matters when you want to upzone. It's not just about allowing more units on a property. It's about actually allowing the bulk of the structure that's on that property to be bigger and have more units in it. That's an issue that has dogged other jurisdictions that have tried these sorts of reforms. And so I'm really I want to keep an eye on this to see how it progresses. I really hope that Ontario makes some kind of move in the future to enable structures themselves to actually be larger. That's something that can make or break this kind of reform.
Okay. What about this super mayor?
So when that was first announced, I wrote about it with my colleague Steve Lafleur, and both of us thought this just looks like the province is passing the buck. So never mind the democratic stuff. Those are interesting arguments. I'm looking at it from the perspective of getting housing built, and mayors have basically have the same incentives as councillors, which is not to build that much housing. You certainly get mayors that are pro housing, and I commend the courage it takes to be a pro housing mayor in a city. And when I say pro housing, I mean not just tinkering here and there, like these big bang sort of reforms, like upzoning huge swaths of the city. It just seemed like the province was passing the buck and saying, okay, we're going to give more responsibility to the mayors. It's ostensibly to get more housing built, but the mayor's incentives are not to get housing built. So I think that the province, if they really want to do that, they just need to take take the bull by the horns and do it themselves, as is happening in Nova Scotia and elsewhere.
The current legislation has targets for the growth of housing in different municipalities around the GTA. And I had a planner tell me recently that right now most of the municipalities are at like 5 to 10% on average every year building the amount of housing that's actually targeted in this legislation. How can they increase their building by like tenfold?
The math kind of boggles the mind. We're talking about minimum doubling province wide construction. So that's why I'm looking at this. I don't want to say with skepticism. I'd rather say cautious optimism, because it's better to be optimistic. But I don't know how they're going to do it. I like the idea of targets. Actually, I like the idea of the 1.5 million homes. CMHC actually argues it should be more, but having a goal, because otherwise, municipalities will say, well, yeah, we're building enough housing because this is what we estimate is needed. Well, whose estimate is better than whose estimate, right? And no estimate is perfect, but every time I've talked to engineers, usually at the regional level, who work on wastewater, et cetera, they say everything's fine because there's a target that we're working towards, and we're going to have enough infrastructure to satisfy this kind of demand for the next 20, 30 years. And they're doing their job, but the estimate that they're working off of is is wrong, right? It's a fraction of what the province has laid out. So the fact that the province has laid it out is really important because it really it really signals to municipalities this is how much we need. But whether that's actually going to be built, we'll see. Again, I'm an optimist. We used to build actually more housing than we do now in the 1970s with a smaller population. So I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's going to take probably more than the reforms we've seen so far.
So let's talk economics for a second here, if we could. Housing is unaffordable right now, we think, in the Greater Toronto area, and what we got to do is we got to try to reduce the price. Construction costs are probably not going to go down. If anything, construction costs have been going up. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe. Yeah, with inflation, all of the bricks and sticks, if that's what you're talking about, have gone up.
And the construction workers, the laborers, the carpenters, et cetera, that's not going to go down.
You mean there's a shortage? Because
I'm asking. Do you think that do you think construction workers are going to be offering to work for less?
Oof, I don't think so. Okay. I think there's going to be wage pressures there like anywhere else.
So the cost of construction is going to be set. The typical development, the developer takes supposedly 20%. Are they going to agree to take less return on their investment?
Well, no, the profit is not because they're greedy developers. They need it to secure funding from banks, right. So they can't touch their profits.
Are the banks going to reduce their interest rate?
I don't see why they would.
So if the construction cost is not going to go down, if the interest rate's not going to go down, if the developer's profit as a percentage is probably going to be in that 15 to 20% range, so that's not going to go down. There's only two other things that can go down: the land cost or the amount that the government takes.
Yep.
And development charges is one major portion of what the government takes, and you've already addressed that in our first conversation. I don't think you can say that every landowner is going to take a massive reduction, and I think that land is typically usually about 20% of the equation, and so therefore, if you got to have a 20 or 30% decline in housing prices, land's not going to be worth zero. So that's not going to be the answer. The impact of municipalities is not just the development charges we've talked about. It is the time, the interest that you incur over time to finance your project, all the regulatory impediments, and I've been told that some of these regulatory process, the legal process of going to the city, going to the Ontario Land Tribunal, are hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Well, time is money, right? So that's part of the cost, in both time and in hard cash.
So if you're going to reduce housing by a significant percentage, you almost got to get rid of this whole 5-year approval process, Ontario Land Tribunal process, litigation expense process, and if not, get rid of it completely. You've got to reduce it dramatically, don't you?
Absolutely. The certainty, like uncertainty is the enemy of investment, right? And all of these major projects are investments. If there's a whiff of uncertainty, you have to have deep pockets, you have to be brave and ready to take this on. So you're not going to see much more entrance in the industry if you've got a really complex, hard to navigate system. And kudos to the Ford government for trying to create certainty in some areas. There's probably a lot more to be done, definitely a lot more to be done in that regard. But if the timelines are either long or worse than long, uncertain, how can anyone make investments in this kind of climate without having lots of cash on hand in order to take this on, or just not take it on, not enter the industry, and not go for it? Again, it's the unseen. How many folks would actually be entering this industry? How many mom and pop developers would be entering this industry to do 2, 3, 4 unit jobs if it was a straightforward process? If zoning reforms like the ones we've seen become widespread. So these are the kinds of questions that I ask myself, and that I wonder, if certainly the province is thinking about this, but it's based on the current climate, I don't know how people can jump into this industry with confidence.
We're chatting tonight with Josef Filipowicz about development charges, about housing affordability, about what municipal governments have got wrong. It's a fascinating conversation. We're going to take a last break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've been having a really good conversation, at least I've been enjoying it, with Josef Filipowicz, who is an expert in public policy on housing, land use, local government finance, etc. He's recently written a piece on development charges. Where would we find that most easily if people are interested in reading it? Is it on your Twitter or on your website, or where could we most easily find it?
Oh, it's on the National Post. I have neither Twitter nor a website, so you
go to the National Post and
go to the National Post
and search Josef Filipowicz or development charges. It was a well written article. I enjoyed it. Thank you for publishing that. So we've talked about development charges. We've talked about housing affordability. We've talked about regulatory processes. We've talked about super mayors. Josef, what's the solution to housing affordability?
Well, I've been enjoying the conversation too, David, so I'll give you that. Housing affordability is such a wicked problem. We use that term in like public policy parlance. Like it's a problem that is almost intractable, right? Because in order to do something that's really meaningful, somebody's got to lose out, right? There's no perfect solution. And I think the Ford government has started, and not just started, they clearly understand this and are clearly okay with ruffling some feathers. Cities have to grow upwards, they have to grow outwards, and both of those options make certain people, unhappy. So kudos to the government for having the courage to do that. I don't see electorally how that's the best idea, but they're doing it, for the right reasons, which is to make this province more affordable. So when it comes to solutions, we talked earlier about, how long does it take, how much does it cost, and how certain is the process of developing new homes. If you can reduce that length, if you can reduce those costs, and if you can reduce that uncertainty, you're going to go a long way towards seeing some results.
So I agree with you. I think we have to dramatically reduce the time period of regulatory review of development permits, building permits, zoning changes of the like. And I think one of the ways that we can best do that is by having official plans that actually are consistent with where the province wants to go, official plans that actually look like they're actually going to be allowing the kind of housing to be built over time that equal what we all know that needs to be built if we're going to absorb the 1.5 million growth of housing units over the course of the next 10 years. And as you pointed out, CMHC actually said it was 1.8 million in 8 years, in excess of what would otherwise be built. So it's this 1.5 million target is far lower than CMHC was actually quoting in their studies. And so I think time and regulatory burden is a really big issue because, as you pointed out, time is money. And I do think that I've had the privilege of being in my career involved in the beer industry, the entertainment industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the sports. But I've been a bunch of different industries. There are more regulatory processes and regulatory meddling in real estate than in anything other than pharmaceuticals. And in pharmaceuticals, it was like an on-off switch. You submitted the studies and they said yes or no. They didn't meddle in it like they meddle in it in the development industry. And so I don't know why we came to this opinion that planning departments and local councillors are so expert at trying to figure out what we should build. Why don't we let the market decide what we're going to build rather than having planning councils and planning departments and people decide that? I also think that you're right that development charges are too high. I think that they are a real impediment to affordability. And I think as tax policy, it's bad tax policy because it's user pay plus with profit built in. And I don't think that's right. I think it's regressive, whereas you pointed out the most vulnerable pay. And I don't think we, in any other place in our society, think that regressive tax systems where users have to pay and the most vulnerable users have to pay, and they have to pay more than the value that they're getting. So it makes no logical sense. I do think that residential property taxes are, particularly in Toronto, too low, and commercial property taxes Maybe appropriate, maybe a little bit too high. But I think there needs to be a complete rebalancing of that, both within Toronto, between commercial and residential, but also within the whole GTA, such that it makes sense. And I do think that David Miller may have had it right back, when was it, 10 years ago, when he was saying you can never pay it on property taxes because it's effectively a regressive wealth tax. And maybe it should be a 1% of the GST or HST today should go to cities so that they have a funding source that can actually fund all the infrastructure expenses that they've got to get. Or your Quebec example of the provincial government getting far more involved in building things for growth.
Which was the
bottom
previous
line,
Ontario.
But bottom line, I think this is a major issue. And I think in this situation, the government is the problem. And it's primarily municipal local governments that are the problem. And I think that's what the Ford government is attacking, is changing. Maybe not enough. I'm not sure you should do it through undemocratic ways like super mayors that can pass things with a minority of council. But I do think that NIMBYism that is given oxygen to the fire with councillors that think they can only get voted in if they adhere to the NIMBYs in their wards, means that we get far less housing approved than we need, and it takes far longer to get it approved, and is far more expensive than it otherwise would be. And that's the problem that needs to be attacked. What do you think, Joseph?
Well, you said a lot there, and I would say I probably agree with 99% of it. If you ask me what the 1% is, I forget, because I agreed with almost everything you said.
Josef Filipowicz,
and on that last note, yep.
Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Right, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Come back again. That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from downtown Toronto, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.